a very special program tonight with a very special guest. My name is Mark Johnson. I am the founder of the Montana World Affairs Council. We are a nonprofit organization, nonpartisan. What we seek to do is to educate communities about the world around them. We particularly like to focus on students from both high school and the university. So those of you who fall into those categories, thank you so much for joining us. I have the luxury, and you have the luxury as well. I'm going to be very brief because people that know more and are more important than I will follow me in just a moment. I want to say one or two words about the importance of this topic. You know, Martin Luther King once asked the question, why do men hate each other? He said, the reason men hate each other is because they don't know each other. And the reason they don't know each other is because they never talk to each other. They don't know how to talk. They don't know how to communicate. What you're about to hear and learn about is one of the finest examples of public diplomacy, and by that I mean people-to-people diplomacy, that I, as a former diplomat for 30 years, have ever seen, ever witnessed. And it's quite a tribute to the culture, that dynamic spirit of the United States. Not only were these magnificent musicians, they were great ambassadors for their country. And I urge you, after the talk and during Dr. Curtis Sandberg's lecture, to pay attention to the slides. It is now my great pleasure and honor to introduce the primary organizer and sponsor of this event, Dr. Barb Kustra, who is the director of the Montana Museum for Art and Culture. I can tell you that she's been working on this event now, not for weeks or days, but literally for months. And it will be a great tribute to her as this program unfolds, and you are part of the success of it. And we are greatly honored to have Curtis Sandberg, Dr. Curtis Sandberg, the Vice President of the Meridian International, which is one of the leading institutions in the United States that promotes art and culture and people-to-people diplomacy. So please welcome Barbara Kustra.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Ambassador Johnson. Can you hear me all right? Great. The first thing I want to do is express my thanks due to our important friends and sponsors for Jam Session America's Jazz Ambassadors Embrace the World and the exhibit, and they include not only the Montana World Affairs Council, but also Joseph S. Sample in memory of his wife Miriam, the Gallagher Western Montana Charitable Foundation, KTMF ABC 23 Max Media of Montana, Montana Public Radio, the Buddy DeFranco Jazz Festival, First Interstate Bank, who hosts one of our satellite exhibits featuring Henry Malloy jazz portraits, the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Library on our very campus, which is hosting another satellite exhibit by the very wonderful Jim Todd with his jazz portraits. So there you have a wonderful long list of fellow presenters. We are delighted to bring you Dr. Curtis Sandberg. Not only did he fly out here from Washington yesterday, but so did his wife and son, and it's a good thing they brought their skis and their umbrellas because they did show up yesterday, but it's gotten quite a bit nicer, right, Curtis? As Vice President for Arts and Cultural Programs, he's responsible for developing and managing exhibitions presented by Meridian International Center in Washington, D.C. He also directs the Meridian Traveling Exhibitions Service that takes Meridian organized exhibits around the United States and the world, including right here in Missoula. He holds a BA degree in classical archaeology from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and an MA and PhD degrees from Harvard University. He's had a whole host of museum experiences, including, well, in the US and in Europe, working in a variety of fields, including research, curatorial work, collections, oversight, catalog organization, I should say, and archival management. He's been involved in a number of archaeological projects in the Middle East, in Europe, and in this country. He's taught at Harvard, he's taught at the John Burroughs School in St. Louis, and lectured at a host of national conferences, at museums, on diplomatic missions, and cultural organizations around the United States. He was a Rotary International Fellow a Fulbright Hayes Fellow, a Harvard Sinclair Kennedy Fellow, and a Whiting Fellow, and I think he's quite a fellow. Please give a jazzy and warm Montana welcome to Dr. Curtis Sandberg.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much for being here. Can you all hear? This works out great. And Barb, thank you so much, because my 6-year-old son who's waving at me over there wonders sometimes why I come home at 8 o'clock at night. And this is a good reason, so you're all here to help me with my family. Jam Session is a really unique exhibit. It's the likes of which we've never done before, and it focuses on a very specific subject matter. And people have often asked, you know, how we at Meridian International Center came to choose this project. It's a little bit sort of off kilter for us. Now, our organization's mission, and we're in 2 beautiful John Russell Pope houses, just a block or, you know, about a mile up the street from the White House. But our organization's mission, which is the promotion of international understanding through the exchange of people, ideas, and the arts, embodies the spirit, which was really so common among the jazz ambassadors, and we at Meridian have long considered their travels to be among America's most successful efforts at making friends abroad. I mean, as the ambassador said, it was something that was a long, long program. It was wildly successful, and we thought, you know, what can we do with this? Is there an exhibit in it? Now, Meridian's, this is our other house, Meridian's Art for Cultural Diplomacy program is dedicating to creating exhibits that inform Americans about places and about people around the world, and ultimately to fulfill our mission in the largest possible way. As Barb was just saying, we send these to museums and to cultural institutions across the United States after displaying them at our galleries in Washington, D.C., and this was actually a jam session opening at Meridian. Now, I want to give you all a plug here, because we have been having the best time in our office and at Meridian, hearing the public service, the PSAs, learning all about what Barb and her colleagues have done. So Missoula is really tops in our office, and we're very, very proud of what you've all done. And you know, thanks to the museum, to the university, to the World Affairs Council and others, it's an excellent case of what a venue should be. Now, within that context, please accept our thanks for everything you've done. Now, another important aspect of our work is, you know, this is the domestic part. We also create American art exhibits to travel to countries abroad. You know, there's sort of the U.S. component outside. And all of these, both domestic and outside, they're intended to highlight key elements of our culture and those of others worldwide, and obviously to encourage people from different backgrounds, from different cultures, different religions, to better understand and respect one another, which ultimately we all know is something that is sorely lacking and terribly important in today's world. Now, again, back to Jam Session, it's different from our normal model. We're normally doing fine art and things like that, but an exhibit chronicling the Jazz Ambassador's story, we've been mulling this over for a while. It just never really quite went away. Now, the catalyst for actually doing it was in the summer of 2007, and at that time, Dana Gioia, who's now at the Aspen Institute, but Dana Gioia was the head of the National Endowment for the Arts, you know, for the NEA in Washington, D.C. He's a huge jazz fan. His brother teaches jazz at Stanford, and he interviewed, and this is interesting, let's see if we can make that go away. There we go. He interviewed Dave Brubeck, you know, the jazz great Dave Brubeck, and it was literally on the cusp of what was going to be the 50th anniversary of Dave's 1958 tour to South Asia and to the Near East. And in this sort of question and answer, Dana, Dave, there was this very cool picture. And it was at a moment also that things weren't really so great with our undertakings in Iraq. And here in 1958 is the classic Dave Brubeck quartet arriving in Baghdad and on Iraqi Airlines. And so, as you know, when you look at a history book or anything of that kind, there's a little photo credit on the bottom, and it noted that it was at from the University of the Pacific at Stockton, California. So I just picked up the telephone and I called them. It really captured our attention, and with the help of the archivist at the University Library, we gained immediately a very, very clear sense of their holdings. And we were also introduced to the work of somebody who's quite unique, a woman who teaches at the University of Michigan, Dr. Penny von Eschen. Now, Penny, you know, in every endeavor, there's sort of the one person who does it, and in this particular case, Penny, and she's got a good catch of the phrase, her book is called Satchmo Blows Up the World. It's about Louis Armstrong. And she had really written the seminal volume on Cold War jazz diplomacy. So armed with this information, you know, having met the California folks, knowing Professor von Eschen, we asked her to collaborate with us, and she said, oh my goodness, I did my book a couple of years ago with Harvard University Press. They were terribly mean. I wanted to put lots and lots of pictures in, and they would only let me put 12 pictures in my book. So she immediately said, I've never done an art show before, but if this is my opportunity, I'm absolutely in. So she was thrilled about it. Now, as we learned more about the subject, I realized that it was going to be necessary to contact a wide range of important collections around the United States. Benny Goodman's materials. You know, Benny Goodman was one of the jazz ambassadors. They were at the Gilmore Music Library at Yale University. His family gifted them after his death. Satchmo, Louis Armstrong, had an enormous, Louis kept everything. He kept his toothbrushes, his dentures, there's dental floss. I mean, it is astonishing the weird stuff that Louis Armstrong kept, and it's all carefully archived and has accession numbers on it. But they're at the Louis Armstrong House Museum, which is in Queens, and specifically at Queens College. Documents from Dizzy Gillespie. You know, Dizzy went out on the first tour in 1956. They're at the Institute of Jazz Studies at Rutgers University in Newark, New York. Duke Ellington's holdings are at the Smithsonian, and Duke was another pack rat, and all of his things are at the National Museum of American History in the Archives Center. What else? Crucial materials from the State Department's cultural collections, and this is kind of an interesting thing. It was a quirk that we were surprised by. The State Department's materials were going to be basically pulp. They were going to throw them away in the late 1970s. All of the treasure trove of the jazz tours were, you know, sort of on the junk pile. And some very, very thoughtful and very sort of, you know, enterprising people at the State Department with a sense of the future saved them. They put them in bankers' boxes, and they were all shipped out to Fayetteville, Arkansas, to the University of Arkansas Library, and it's because of the connection with Senator Fulbright. And I think it's very interesting that you have the Mansfield Library here, and it's another one of those things that terribly important things come to libraries where there are statespeople that are associated with them. Now, eventually, we also located photographs of Woody Herman from the Woody Herman Society down in South Florida. We explored papers related to the Voice of America at the University of North Texas in Denton, and the search really was exhaustive. Now this is where it got kind of fun because, you know, jazz, it's a network. And curators and archivists at each of these institutions, they shared further information with us, and this grapevine started growing. It was just uncanny, and we weren't expecting it. And suddenly, people were calling us. You know, the phone was coming in rather than out. And Meridian does a lot of different things. It's a pretty, you know, complete organization. And people that we didn't know were calling and saying, are you those cool people in Washington, D.C. who do exhibits about jazz diplomacy? So suddenly, sort of things began coming in over the transom. We began building a really impressive collection of photographs, documents, stories about the jazz tours, acquiring informants and helpers who were excited about the project, and it kind of became an extended family. It's very different than anything we've really done before. Now, to compile the nearly 100 images that make up Jam Session that you can see out here in the various galleries, we looked at tens of thousands of photographs. There are a lot of things out there. Now, these were not, to be fair, these were not considered great art at the time they were taken. They weren't considered historic documents. The process by which many pictures found their way into public and private collections was often accidental and fortuitous. And by and large, let's be real, they were snapshots. You know, this is not Edward Weston, it's not Ansel Adams, they're not daguerreotypes. I mean, they're you know, travel snapshots. And you know, the way that this happened, they were products of occasional band member with a camera. In this case, for example, it's Dave Brubeck and his wife Iola and their two boys, Darius and Michael, in Warsaw. And it was taken by Paul Desmond, the great jazz trumpeter who was part of the Brubeck Quartet. Others were snapped by diplomats who just happened to have a Brownie camera, a Polaroid, and you know, they wanted to record a jazz ambassador's visit. And still others by local journalists, and you'll see some of them in here, who also recorded the visits they, for their newspapers and all around the world, and then they gave a copy of the print to the jazz ambassadors as a souvenir of their trip to fill in the blank country. And these became treasured possessions of the jazz ambassadors, and they're in archives all over the United States. Now, some of these were in horrible condition. They weren't really treated very nicely. Others didn't really offer, frankly, they were boring. They didn't offer a sense of the excitement that was generated by the arrival of these renowned American jazz musicians in faraway places. And yet, there were some hidden gems. Really good ones. And when we found these, we included them in the exhibit. You know, the idea was just find the best ones of these tens of thousands. And in this particular, there's this absolutely, it's an endearing image. It's Louis Armstrong, obviously, sitting on a camel, his wife Lucille with the Bell and Howell movie cameras, taking a picture of him at the, you know, the pyramids and the Sphinx. The photograph was actually taken by an Egyptian newspaper journalist and photographer working for Al-Ahram, who traveled around with Satchmo. And it's the grand tour, jazz style. I mean, you know, there's the same way that you find lithographs from the 19th century, you know, Robert's prints and things like that. Here's Louis, and in his notebooks up at the Institute and at the Armstrong House Museum, it's in a scrapbook, and he's got a little thing, he had his typewriter, and he added on the bottom of it, it said, "The camel was the only guy who didn't ask me for money for a ticket." So we had a sense of humor about the whole thing. Now, in order to portray, you know, we've got these tens of thousands of photographs, we're weeding through them, trying to make an art show that tells the story. You know, this dynamic program, it began in the mid-50s, it continued through the 1970s. We began thinking, you know, Barb mentioned before about my background sort of in, you know, sort of archival management, also with archaeology. You know, what was the system going to be? How did we categorize this stuff in order to make a show? So we ultimately came up with 4 categories, and they seemed to make sense, and they ultimately revealed themselves as pretty good choices. One category were images reflecting what the US government wanted, their desire that musicians befriend foreign elites, that they go out and meet leaders. And here's Count Basie in Burma in 1971. Another category depicted the hope of the jazz ambassadors, because they were kind of cooler than you know, the people who wanted them to go out, because they were jazz guys. They just, you know. And you know, this was eloquently stated by Dizzy Gillespie, when he commented that, quote, "We wanted to play for local cats. And the people, and meet the people." And in this case, Dizzy is playing for local snakes in Karachi, Pakistan in 1956. And you know, I can't talk about all of these because I'll run us out of time, but if anybody would do me the enormous favor of remembering the snake picture, there's a really cool story. So, you know, in question and answer, please, let's try to get back to that. Another category, the third category, because we figured we would get slaughtered by jazz fans. Jazz fans are, some of you in here, you guys are serious. And we wanted to have pictures of your heroes in clearly recognizable places abroad. And in this case, it's the Duke Ellington, there's the Duke. And it's the Ellington Orchestra in the Roman Amphitheater in Amman, Jordan, in ancient Philadelphia in 1963. And finally, because, you know, this is travel matters, the last category was some extraordinary photos of musicians in transit, you know, that recall the excitement of travel in a time when most Americans did not visit such exotic locales. Most people didn't go to places like this, let alone on jet airplanes. Now, this is Benny Goodman in 1957 in Tokyo, at Tokyo International Airport. Who did this? So, you know, so there is the romance of travel category as well. So the result of these 4 categories and a lot of digging in archives is a collection that captures the dynamism of the tours, and it shares the spirit of such far-reaching people-to-people encounters, and it reminds us of the lasting value of these kinds of exchanges. Now, it bears noting, and this is terribly important because it's not like this died in 1978, there's still some really excellent cultural diplomacy initiatives, and one of them that we're very fond of at Meridian is called the Rhythm Road Program, and it's a State Department initiative, but it's run on a contract with Jazz at Lincoln Center up in New York. And they're sending jazz ambassadors all over the planet. But so, you know, let's all, you know, underscore that in today's world, there's always room for more. We need to make friends out there. And the Jazz Ambassadors model, which began such a long time ago, remains an ideal template. Okay, the map, why we've got this map. We have to place jam session in historical context. There's a reason for the Jazz Ambassadors. It wasn't just, it just didn't hatch accidentally one morning. And you know, ultimately to, you know, highlight some of the great moments, I'd like to tell you a bit of some of the finer points of what all happened in the tours that you see in the exhibit. So we have to provide a background about why this happened at all. And to do this, we got to go back to the mid-1950s, which was, as many of you know, a very hot moment in the Cold War. Now, for some years, European powers, among them England, France, Belgium, had been divesting themselves of their colonial possessions, you know, all over places like Africa and Asia and elsewhere. And the result was, and this is starting sort of in the early 50s and onward, a great many newly independent, at the time they were called non-aligned countries, that for the United States, but also for the Soviet Union, constituted potential allies. And we were really courting them. And it was alliances, it was strategic bases for the Cold War, for our military initiatives. It was sources of needed raw materials. You know, they had stuff that we didn't have and the Soviets didn't have, and much, much more. And there was this sort of undercurrent of the Cold War that was the cultural diplomacy part. It was about sort of befriending these non-aligned countries. So in what soon emerged as a battle for the hearts and minds, it's the hearts and minds thing, but 50 years before, of people around the world, the Soviets were very clever about this. They sent artists on tour who exemplified long-standing Russian cultural traditions, the friendly side of the Soviet Union. Ballet, the Bolshoi, the Kirov, symphonic music, folk music. And at the same time that they were sending these things and art exhibits all around, they're absolutely disparaging the United States, A, for an absolute dearth of homegrown artistic treasures, saying those Americans, they're a new, brassy kind of a culture, they don't really have anything like we do, but even more so for our lack of racial equality. This is in the middle of Jim Crow America. And they're presenting themselves as this happy worker state where sort of, Kazakhs and Tajiks and Georgians and Caucasians, they all love each other and they work, and, the United States is this bad place. And this is, there were problems. There were obviously very, very serious problems, in the fabric of our society. But the United States was alarmed by this. The Russians were making some headway. People abroad were listening. And our government really spent some time considering appropriate ways to respond to this. Now, Washington realized that the Russians could not claim jazz. This is like the why jazz part. Now, in this wonderful New Yorker cartoon from the 1950s that we dug up as part of making the show, there's this group of, kind of serious-looking U.S. government officials, smoking cigars, and there's the Washington Monument outside. They're in some sort of federal office building. And the caption is great. It reads, "This is a diplomatic mission of the utmost delicacy. And the question is, who is the best man for it? John Foster Dulles, as the Secretary of State, or Satchmo?" And again, jazz. Like, do we send out Louis Armstrong or do we send our Secretary of State? Now, this came about in part because jazz music had grown in popularity around the globe since, in World War I, with our soldiers being abroad, it kind of started there. And then after World War II, the Voice of America kicks in. This is a really key element in the whole jazz tours. They began broadcasting jazz programs to audiences abroad, and specifically there was a show called Music USA, and it was hosted by a fellow that nobody in the United States knew about because there was a sort of a law, it was an act of Congress that things for abroad weren't broadcast domestically. So Willis was amazing, but no one here knew who the heck he was. But this first aired in 1955, and it soon reached tens of millions of listeners. Now, Conover saw jazz, and he had something crazy like a 50,000 LP collection. He had the biggest collection of jazz records on earth. But he saw jazz as fundamentally democratic in nature, and he made structural parallels with jazz to the American political system. And as such, what he did is he considered jazz and freedom as synonymous. And his incredibly charismatic presentations were a really important link to the West for just countless people, ultimately millions, as I said, of people living behind the Iron Curtain. And what no one expected is that these signals, relay stations, were set up in Tangiers in Morocco, and I think there was another one in Bavaria, in southern Bavaria, toward the Alps. And just atmospheric conditions were such that these signals bounced way farther than anybody imagined would happen. And suddenly people in Iran are hearing Willis Conover. So soon Willis's broadcasts were also reaching people there. And I think it began with 30 million listeners, and a decade into what was going on with him, over 100 million people were listening to Willis. He visited Poland in 1959, and something crazy like 15 or 20,000 weeping, happy Poles came to the Warsaw airport to meet him, and nobody in America knew who he was. Now, as U.S. Cold War policymakers became increasingly aware of the power of jazz, we've sort of got the Willis Conover thing, and they're realizing we have to battle the Soviets in some way. Legendary CBS correspondent Edward R. Murrow, the good night and good luck man from the movie, organized a visit in 1956 by Louis Armstrong and his All-Stars, Edmund Hall and Trummy Young, to Africa, and it was produced by CBS. And the idea was to go to the British Gold Coast, which a year later became Ghana. And it was all set up as Louis visiting the land of his ancestors. And Louis took it really seriously, as he did with everything. This would soon be, a year later, it would become Ghana. And what we see in this great picture is Satchmo accompanied by his wife Lucille, who you saw moments ago with the Bell and Howell movie camera at the pyramids a few years later. They met with Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah, or who would become the Prime Minister of Ghana. And they're in the rec room in Nkrumah's basement in Accra, in what would become Ghana. And they're playing miniature hockey. There's a little puck on there. And it's just the craziest thing in the world, and they're really happy with each other. And they just, that was jazz diplomacy back then, go play like foosball with people in their basement in Africa. So what happened later that afternoon is the band left Nkrumah's house, and they played an open-air concert for an audience that was estimated to have reached nearly 500,000 people. Women with babies on their backs came out of the bush to this thing. No one heard anything. The amplification was miserable. But there it was, Louis Armstrong, sort of, and all at the time of the civil rights movement and people's just great desire for self-determination in Africa. And 500,000 people show up to hear our jazz ambassadors. So the astonishing impact of this 3-day commercial tour, it was 3 days long, was not lost in Washington. It's like Willis Conover, the people all around the world, Louis with CBS. It's like, hey, jazz, there's something there. Now, around this time, and this is what clinches it, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr. encouraged the State Department and the Eisenhower administration to send Dizzy Gillespie on a goodwill tour of Southern Europe, the Middle East, and South Asia. Now, Dizzy was as charismatic as they come, and he won over audiences of all kinds. Here are Iranian leaders. This is the sister of the Shah of Iran. It's a remarkable little 1.5-inch photograph that I fished out of a box in the Smithsonian, and no one knew what it was. It was uncatalogued, and we were able to tell them, this is Dizzy. It's the first State Department tour. He's meeting royalty. He convinced these Yugoslav musicians and fans to let him ride their motorcycle in Zagreb in 1956, and lasting friendships grew out of this. Greek students who days before Dizzy's band arrived had rioted in Athens in protest of U.S. policies, and they had tried to burn down the U.S. Information Service office. They went crazy. They loved him. And so anyhow, he insisted that concert tickets be given free to the young and the poor. He expressed interest in local musical traditions and customs. And his precedent-setting tour led many to formally embrace jazz diplomacy. And jazz diplomacy could be fun. This is in Santo Domingo. This is a mixed-race band to remember the Jim Crow America moment in terms of the Russian criticism of the United States. It's a mixed-race band. It's led by an African-American. It even includes a woman, unheard of at the time, Melba Liston, who was a great arranger and trombonist. And the voyage could reasonably have led to the musicians being co-opted. I mean, there is that, are these guys going to become pawns in terms of a propaganda war with the Soviet Union? But Dizzy was so outspoken, and he publicly shared his thoughts about American society. And he had a kind of a mantra, and it was that the United States is a work in progress, which remains really, I think we can all agree, it's to this day. It's a work in progress. We learn, we change it. And this somewhat mitigated Russian comments to the contrary. So the tour and later voyages gave by African Americans, gave musicians, including Gillespie band member Quincy Jones, who was on that tour, an opportunity to express their beliefs and their criticisms on a world stage, and then to bring them home. It had an impact on the civil rights movement here in the United States. People abroad really paid attention to this, and as those of you who have seen the jam session catalog or the exhibit, but the catalog in particular, we were incredibly fortunate. Quincy wrote the foreword to our catalog. This was one of the great moments of my life, and he retains to this day that this tour was one of the great moments of his life, that everything was different after he went out with Diz in 1956. Now later the same year, and we're still in 56, clarinetist Benny Goodman and his orchestra began their first trip abroad, and was government tour, and they visited Thailand, Burma, Japan, and Benny, who was his sobriquet, or his moniker was the King of Swing. He was really adept at befriending royals and other leaders. He jammed at the palace in Bangkok with the Thai king, who was an accomplished jazz musician, and still the King of Thailand. He's still, I think he's the longest reigning monarch on earth. It's King Bhumibol. He gave him a clarinet as a gift. He encountered the Japanese royal family. These are the children of Emperor Hirohito, and the fellow in the middle is the now Emperor of Japan, Akihito, and his younger brother and his younger sister with Alice Goodman. He was introduced on stage in Burma by U Thant, who later became the Secretary General of the United Nations, was then the assistant to the President of Burma. And as with this tour, with Dizzy's tour, the orchestra, Benny's orchestra, they made friends with local people. They expressed interest in their music, and to quote one government official, we found a lot of documents as we did this, quote, "They strengthened the impression that America is not only great in modern plumbing and fancy cars, but in things of the spirit and the arts." So jazz is working. Now the first jazz ambassador tour behind the Iron Curtain took place in 1958. And that's when Dave Brubeck and his integrated quartet played for I have enthusiastic in my notes here, but I think ecstatic is a better word. Audiences in Poland. He made friends with Polish musicians. They met people on the street, as we saw before with his wife and his kids. And at the band's final concert, and this is in Poznan, they performed a Chopin-esque composition, you know, Chopin, the hero of all Poles in classical music. And it was written in recognition of the Poles' reverence for their own music. And he proclaimed to, it was loudly applauded, people wept in the audience. It's, you know, the height of communism, and the Poles are not feeling really good about it. And he proclaimed to audiences around the country that, quote, "No dictatorship can tolerate jazz. It's the first sign of a return to freedom." So again, you know, these guys, as the ambassador said, they really knew what they were doing. In the Middle East and South Asia, band members met leaders, they connected with people on the street, they jammed with musicians, and Brubeck, in fact, was so influenced by local music, you know, he was really paying attention, that he later recorded an album based on compositions done in trains and buses and airplanes called Jazz Impressions of Eurasia, and some of the songs are on the CD that's playing outside. And he incorporated the sounds and the rhythms that they encountered on the road. So this is a two-way street. It's not just, you know, we're out there teaching the world, we're learning. Now, within a couple of years of this, Dave and his wife Iola celebrated but also satirized the State Department tours, because again, there is this element of sending African Americans out there, you know, is this good, is this bad? And you know, they wanted to look at all sides of it. And they put together, they collaborated with Louis Armstrong and with other jazz greats in a musical, sort of an opera almost, called The Real Ambassadors. And it was performed only once at the 1962 Monterey Jazz Festival, and it's sort of been resurrected recently. It's great. They were keenly aware of the difficult social issues that were facing the United States, but the Brubecks, like the others, they were believers in the American system and its capacity for change. And they wanted, within this context, they wanted to honor Louis Armstrong's contributions to the civil rights movement, but at the same time to emphasize his role, his really key role as America's premier musical diplomat, or as he was known at the time, Ambassador Satch. Now, the racial situation in America, and specifically at the time of the Eisenhower administration, there was a little fumble. And you all know from your history books, or those of you who are old enough to remember, in 1957, the Little Rock school integration crisis. And the federal government didn't quite get off the stick fast enough on that. And Louis was so enraged, he was so angry at these kids being denied access to a school, that he refused to travel to the USSR. He actually had a press conference, friendly, nice, genteel Louis Armstrong got at a microphone in front of a lot of reporters. This was front page news in the New York Times that week. And he said, "I will not go." And the quote was, "It's getting so a black man doesn't have a country anymore." And this was so bad, this was such a negative impact in terms of the State Department and the government's efforts to do everything I've been talking about, that Secretary Dulles, the Secretary of State, actually likened Louis' refusal to go to the Soviet Union. The connection was, he said, this is as bad for us as was the Soviet invasion of Hungary a year ago in terms of world public opinion about the United States. And it was so serious with him that he would only go abroad in 1960. It took that long for Louis to really get over it. Now, when he did, there was this 3-month trip, and that was where the Africa picture, the Egypt picture before. 27 cities, 3 months. It showed Louis at his best. In the Republic of the Congo, it's the only color picture in the show, he was carried on a throne by local drummers and dancers. It's actually a beach chair, but it's kind of a throne. On another occasion, rival factions in the Congolese Civil War, which was especially vicious, they actually stopped fighting long enough. Everybody put their weapons down in order to hear Louis play in the stadium. And then they started fighting the next morning. But Louis was very, very proud of that. He always used to tell people, like, I stopped a civil war all by myself with my horn. He felt a really deep connection to people of Africa, as I said before, with that Gold Coast, with the CBS tour. I mean, this was a kind of a going home trip. And his visits, he met people of all kinds. They ranged from encounters with hospitalized children in Egypt. Here he's at a sanatorium in Cairo. He met with dignitaries, with political leaders, and this was a really demanding, sometimes grueling tour. I mean, think this is Africa, 1960-61. And because of exhaustion, his doctor actually stepped in and said, you got to stop. You've got to go. They took a break at Christmas time and the holidays, and they went to Paris for some R&R. But then they went back. It wasn't over. And it was so serious that Velma Middleton, who's the woman holding her hand up to her face on the left-hand side, this is up in Kaduna, northern Nigeria, she had been warned by her doctor because of very high blood pressure and other problems not to go. She died in Sierra Leone. She had a stroke and died on the tour. So, lest we're thinking in terms of sort of, cool modern, sort of jazz gigs out there, comforts, carefully scripted travels with security. Many of the ambassadors experienced sickness, dangerous political situations. This is the band's eye view at Elizabethville, Congo. This is what the Woody Herman band saw when they played the Congolese army. But they undertook these tours. And band members who I talked to actually said, "Oh my God, you have the picture of us in Elizabethville. I'm still scared." And there was rioting. They were incredibly, they worked, they braved all of it, and they were unbelievably effective as ambassadors of goodwill. Now, one of the great examples of this is Duke Ellington. Duke began in 1963. He traveled for the government for 10 years. He persevered in spite of recurrent illnesses, and his first trip to the Middle East and South Asia lasted, as with Louis' tour, it lasted for 3 months. And the word is indefatigable. He just kept going. And he was described in State Department communiques over and over again, as we found these things, as, quote, gracious, articulate, charming, and absolutely winning. Now, like his predecessors, Ellington, and here he is in Ctesiphon in Iraq, trying out sort of local delights, you know, with Paul Gonsalves, with his chief sax player. They were fascinated by regional customs and local music. He, like the others, absorbed local musical traditions. He worked them into his own compositions. He actually recorded an album called Far East Suite that really wasn't about the Far East, it was about the Near East, but it came out based on what he was hearing, and celebrated these influences. Now, Duke would travel into Africa in 1966. Here he's meeting with President Senghor, the poet-president of Senegal, in Dakar for the first World Festival of Negro Arts. He went to Latin America. He went to Asia. He made a triumphal return tour to Sri Lanka after the '63 tour. He's back in '72. And look how happy these women are in the stands. The Duke's back. You know, this is like, they missed him for those 9 years, and it's just, we love this picture. Now, the acme of Ellington's career, when it really got, it went absolutely to the top. It came as a musical diplomat. It came in 1971, when he and his orchestra toured the Soviet Union. Now, Benny Goodman had opened the door to the USSR in '62. It was the first option. After that Louis thing that didn't work out, the Soviets closed it up. For 5 years after '57, there was no hope that the U.S. was going to get anybody into the Soviet Union. So it took until '62, and it occurred between the Berlin Wall and the Cuban Missile Crises. Benny toured the country. Here he is on the 4th of July at the U.S. Embassy meeting with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. And there were all sorts of jazz connections, and you know, there was enthusiasm already then. So imagine, this is really pronounced by the early 1970s. Ellington's orchestra, and this is just fans mobbing him outside of the Intourist Hotel in Moscow. They played to packed halls. The fans were deliriously enthusiastic. There were underground jam sessions. This is at the White Knights Club in St. Petersburg with Soviet musicians. They went all night. And one jazz critic, Leonard Feather, called the tour, quote, the greatest coup in the history of musical diplomacy. And it was covered by Life magazine. It was amazing. Now, in late 1973, Duke is suffering from advanced lung cancer. He has terrible arthritis. It's hard to play the piano. And he nonetheless accepted the State Department's invitation to tour Zambia and later Ethiopia for the State Department. In Addis, he performed for Haile Selassie. There's the Emperor of Ethiopia. He received a medal from the Emperor. He jammed with a local jazz fusion musician who, if you tell Ethiopians in Washington, D.C., they give you, like, you know, free extra bread at the restaurant because this guy's really famous. And literally, he went home in November of '73, and I think it was in March or April, it was in the spring, he was dead. He was that sick, but he went out on the tour anyway, and to the end, a believer in the value of cultural diplomacy for our country. Now, having talked, and we're getting close to the end, about some of these jazz tours, it merits considering the logistics and the costs. I mean, think about, you know, we're creating these far-flung, you know, far-reaching voyages. There are thousands of U.S. government employees who are working with the musicians. They're briefing them on the road. They're making sure banal things. They're making sure that the pianos are tuned, the concert halls are booked. And we found a document at the Smithsonian between the State Department and the Ellington organization listing city by city, Baghdad, Colombo in Ceylon, and you know, later Sri Lanka, Kabul, Afghanistan, all the different kinds of pianos, and whether or not there was even anybody there to tune it. And the guy apparently in Ceylon was like out that week, and I don't know what they did to tune the piano, but it was a problem. This was not easy. Now, to lessen this burden, there was a kind of a solution that was made for a while from the late 1960s. There was this really innovative collaboration that emerged between Washington and the Newport Jazz Festival. Its founder, the Newport founder, George Wein, had expertly arranged international jazz tours for years. He was very, very good at this. It was really their sort of métier. And in an incredibly effective public-private partnership, and through Wein's efforts, the United States did this cool thing. They began to book famous musicians who were already performing abroad. This is sort of mitigating sending the entire Duke Ellington Orchestra out from scratch. They got sent to far-flung areas, especially behind the Iron Curtain, and at the conclusion of their commercial tours. So what this did, this provided the U.S. State Department with an opportunity to also reach a whole bunch of sort of new jazz fans who were really into avant-garde jazz. You know, they didn't want to hear sort of New Orleans stuff, or you know, Dave Brubeck may have been out of favor in certain places. And here you got Miles Davis in Belgrade in 1973 with his Yamaha band, and this is completely thrilling in sort of Central Eastern Europe. Groups of American artists would sometimes, you know, they would visit back-to-back jazz festivals in Warsaw and Belgrade and Bucharest and elsewhere, thrilling local fans, but spending days rather than months. And the participants were Miles Davis, Duke Ellington, Charles Mingus, Mingus in Portugal, Sarah Vaughan. Dave Brubeck went back to Poland in 1970 with Jerry Mulligan to great critical acclaim. And yet many other musicians were still doing kind of the old model. And Newport was just one of these. So employed by the government, other groups, some of modest size and some made up of many musicians, traveled until the late 70s when the State Department program actually ended and turned into something else. That was Benny Carter in Ankara in the mid-1970s at the bicentennial. Woody Herman, 1958, went to Latin America. And then in the late 1950s, he visited, or in 66, excuse me, he visited Africa. And that was the picture of the troops. The next year, Randy Weston, pianist Randy Weston from New York, made an extensive trip around Africa, and he was praised by U.S. embassies for his incredible skill as an ambassador. He loved kids, and this is in a middle school in Gabon, and he would do these sort of jazz quizzes. And you know, at the end of his musical performance, he would do sort of a little lecture, and the band members would play the trumpet and the drums and different things, and he would quiz the kids. And anybody who won got a free autographed album. And it's just this absolutely endearing photograph we found at a middle school in Gabon of Randy autographing albums. And he's going strong at 83 or 84, and he's still into kids. Charlie Bird visited Africa and Asia. He jammed with local musicians. He caused a frenzy in Burma. There weren't enough seats at the concert hall, and you know, people went crazy trying to get Charlie Bird concert tickets. Benny Carter and his group, as we saw earlier, they opened bicentennial celebrations in the Middle East. They're here in, and in South Asia, they're here in Rawalpindi. In the mid-70s, they were hailed as excellent ambassadors of American culture. Count Basie, another endearing picture, visited Asia. He played in Laos. In the middle of the Vietnam War, they actually sent him over Cambodia while there was sort of people were shooting at airplanes and scared poor Count Basie. He was, remained one of his frightening jazz experiences. And here he is with the heartthrob of all Burmese teenage girls at the time, Win Oo, who's the great movie star of Burma. And they put together a local Burmese jazzed up version. Ultimately, university jazz bands were on board as well. This is in Togo with the Southern University in Louisiana. And they all met people abroad with the same spirit of friendship and coordination. So this model that was begun during Dizzy's first tour and it continued for over 2 decades, American musicians, sometimes in the course of, as we've said, these really long and arduous tours, braving political instability and illness, they impressed elites. They touched normal people with whom they often spoke candidly about issues at home that were problematic. They gave a really intimate version of our country in a way that, you know, an official of the government couldn't. And because of their vibrant and egalitarian sense of democracy, they're jazz musicians. In Pakistan, for the last leg of the last tour, this is Clark Terry, after they did these amazing performances, all the hotel staff weren't able. They were busy helping the jazz guys, you know, with their linens and pillowcases and bringing them food. And they performed a tour in the hotel for the hotel staff. They actually just did the one night off that they had. They played for the hotel staff because this was the spirit that these guys were all about. Now, the jazz program coincided, as we've seen, with these periods of intense social change and conflict in America, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, Watergate. And as the country adjusted to these new realities, differences clearly occurred between the jazz musicians and organizers on the road, but they were often resolved, or in fact really largely resolved within this sort of on-the-road thing. There were these little bubbles that they figured it out while they were out there. And ultimately these travels were an opportunity for Americans to work together, jazz musicians, government employees, and their service context, to share the best aspects of our culture with the world. So what began as this very unusual and quirky alliance among cultural entrepreneurs, government officials, and musicians took on some really exciting and unpredictable artistic and economic and political dimensions. Now, to emphasize that this is hardly the end of this, it's not like we're looking at ancient history here, let's just fast forward for the last couple of minutes of my talk to the present. Shortly after we opened Jazz Jam Session at Meridian in 2008, the State Department was just ecstatic about this. It's kind of like, oh my goodness, they gave us a birthday present. There's this exhibit about what we did, one of our great, great moments. And they approached us with an idea about the possibility of reproducing the exhibit, just making a copy of it, maybe one of them for travel abroad. And at first we talked about the one thing, but then it got into the Africa desk said they were more important, and the East Asia Pacific desk said they were more important. There are 6 desks. And eventually there was a kind of a Solomonic decision made, which was to our great benefit in terms of what's since happened. They asked us to clone the show 6 times. We've never done this before. So literally, this is what it looked like before it went out on the road. And the picture sort of continues. It was a lot of crates. Last July, all of these went on the road with the State Department. They're in public venues. They're not inside of embassies behind the Marine Guards. They're in places that people can get to them, just as the jazz ambassadors were doing what they did all those years ago. And they've been in these places just amazing. These things are pouring into our office now. This is Belarus. This is at the, in Minsk in Belarus. They did a jam slam with local musicians. It's been in Hungary and in Poland. Here's a picture in Georgia. It opened about 6-8 weeks ago in Tbilisi at their brand new concert hall. The Dominican Republic, I think I've got Mexico. Yeah, this is the opening at Jalapa in Campeche, Mexico. Guatemala, Paraguay, Uruguay. This is people at the opening about a month or so ago in Montevideo, Uruguay. Kazakhstan, the embassy in Uzbekistan was really proud because they got locals to actually design their their jam session signs. And it was apparently a huge hit in Tashkent before it went on to Kazakhstan. It's been in Israel. It's actually in Israel right now. And then here is in Taichung, where the Taichung Jazz Festival is in Taipei, in Taiwan, outside of Taipei in Taiwan. So this international tour is going to continue for another 3 years. We're receiving emails from embassies all around the world thanking us and saying this is so great. This is our job. It's our passion. It's our desire as diplomats to bring the best of the United States abroad. And you all have given us a tool with this exhibit, the same as that you've got it here in Missoula to tell people this story. Now last week, wrapping this all up, at Meridian, we had to give ourselves a party. It's like when something like this happens, you have to have a party. And we got together with the State Department, and we also involved the Smithsonian because it's Jazz Appreciation Month, and that just opened last week. And we celebrated the world tour. And this was in the historic Meridian House that you saw a picture of. We had a cross-section of government, of cultural people, museum leaders, diplomats, foreign ambassadors, and ultimately underscoring with a youth band as well, and underscoring that the model that was created by Dizzy and Quincy and all those folks so many years ago, is still valid. And it can be applied now to jazz, to other musical forms. It could be hip-hop, it could be a lot of other things, to a wide array of performing and visual arts. And in closing, I'd really like to quote the organizer of Dizzy's 56 band. It was Quincy, as I've said a couple of times, Quincy Jones. As he's so aptly noted in our exhibit catalog in the forward. And the quote is, "Jazz helped to build bridges and tell a larger story of America and ourselves to people from all walks of life." Music and art have that kind of power. And the fact that the State Department adopted this model for decades means that it worked. Thank you very much. Now, I guess the last thing before everybody runs out, anybody have any questions? You want to, I think actually I can get away with this. Can I move around and talk? Yeah, I can. So yeah, what's your question?
Well, I'd like to know about the snakes and...
Cool, thank you. I forgot about it. All right, it was kind of a staged thing. It was in Karachi, and it was on the lawn of the hotel. And there's a book that Dizzy wrote his autobiography. It's called To Be or Not to Bop. Disjointed book, but it's very, very funny, and it's really telling. And he's got a whole chapter about the jazz tours. But he was set up, they said, would you like to come out and play with a snake charmer? And Dizzy was always, as I said, like all these guys, he wanted to try that out. He looked at it's a woodwind instrument. He'd never seen one before. So we sat down on the lawn. The woman in the picture, Dottie Salters, is holding a boa constrictor. It's like a python or some huge snake. You can see she's completely terrified. But Dizzy writes about the little snake. And I'm not going to quote it because it's got some expletives, but it's really funny. And the snake apparently lunged at him. And he said he did like the world's fastest back jump in the history of all sports. But the musician, who he thought was a pretty cool guy, he said, come on back up to my hotel room. I want to write this stuff down. I want to take some notations. And you can imagine the hotel staff said, Mr. Gillespie, he can't come in here. He's not allowed to come in here. And Dizzy, this great quote that went down in the annals of jazz diplomacy, Dizzy said, he's a musician, isn't he? He's coming up to my room. And so that really was, that embodied what all these guys were all about. It was like, they really wanted to find out, local things, and it was an exchange. It just wasn't a one-way deal. So any other questions over here?
When you had a picture of the map of South Africa had all these dates from like 50s, 60s, and 70s. Egypt and South Africa had 1922 and 1910 respectively. Why are those dates so far away from each other?
Well, Egypt, this is sort of, it's the idea with that, and it's actually a great question, and thank you. The idea was really to show the majority of, however many of the 50-something countries that are in Africa, that the lion's share of them literally experienced independence after the Second World War. South Africa, because of its status as a British colony, sort of developed, I guess they became a commonwealth or something. They sort of moved through. And Egypt was British as well. It was like Anglo-English Sudan or something like that, after the First World War. It was all part of the Versailles Treaty. But if you look at the majority of the map, that huge chunk of Africa, it was just up for grabs, and the Russians wanted it. And a good example of this is that and it's a little creepy, but underneath that great tour of Louis being carried on the throne and stopping the Civil War, that was in Katanga province. And Katanga province, apparently underneath, if you scratch a little bit, what do they have? Uranium. And this is in the middle of sort of our nuclear moment. And we wanted uranium, and the Russians wanted uranium. So the CIA is engineering sort of assassinations and skullduggery, as are the Russians. But Lewis is out there making friends. So there was this interesting two-tiered thing going on. And in Penny's book, in Professor von Eschen's book, that's really very carefully stated. There's no whitewash there. That it was what it was, but it had a positive result. Anybody else over on this side? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you alluded to the fact that obviously Dizzy Gillespie was really important in all this. Now, would you say he came to the same level that Louis did?
Well, the reason that Dizzy, I guess we plug him so much is because he was the first. It was just that moment that, the CBS tour had happened with Louis Armstrong, and Willis Conover is reaching millions of people on VOA all over the world. And it was Adam Clayton Powell that literally, there was actually, the sidebar was, there was a press conference on the Capitol steps. And Louis had his cool upturned trumpet, and he stood out on the Capitol steps and he played, and the Eisenhower administration had a slush fund. There was this president's culture fund that tour went out on, and no one knew what they were doing. The musicians, nobody briefed them. Because the State Department didn't know either. These guys pretty much got put on an airplane and they showed up. So there wasn't an infrastructure, and the reason that we sort of underscore that first 56 tour, and that picture with the Shah's sister was Shams Pahlavi, that was the first reception of the first night of the first ever State Department tour in Abadan. And it was there initially because they were sent to play for American oil people in the oil fields in Abadan. I mean, even the government wasn't quite clear like who these guys going to play for. But while they were there, they met Iranians, they met Persians. So the model of the education part that later you see Randy Weston, giving kids albums, all of it, the whole infrastructure, it was really invented by Dizzy's band. And then everybody else added on. Duke had something, Randy had something, Dave Brubeck had something. So Dizzy's important, not musically per se any more or less than Lewis or Duke or anybody else, but because that was the first tour, that was where it gelled. So anybody over here? Back here? Pardon me? I know that Willis died in sort of the middle 1990s. I think it was 96 that he died. And he worked for the longest time, but he was a very heavy smoker. I've talked to people. I actually did something on NPR last summer and met a guy who was part of the interview process in the little control room at National Public Radio. And he told me what it was like to work with Willis, because apparently he was a chain smoker, and it was just Willis had throat cancer. So I think early on, there was this at some point in the 70s, I think he had to stop because he just, but he kept his hand in. And you meet VOA people who are of a certain age, and they all remember Willis just haunted the halls of the Voice of America until he died. It was just his thing. He never really quite let it go.
Did the Voice of America maintain the jazz program?
I met a guy, and that was my little boy and my wife who just cut out. There's one of these pet animals farms somewhere up in Maryland that you can pick your own tomatoes, and just our multicultural global world that we live in. This is about 3 months ago. And there was this man and his daughter, and we were all petting the same goat. And they were speaking a really odd language, and we just could not make heads or tails of what language this was. So I asked him, and he said, "Oh, we're speaking Burmese." So I said, "Oh my goodness," I got really excited and told him about Benny Goodman in Burma. And it turns out this is the guy who is the Burmese language specialist today at the Voice of America. And they are still broadcasting because Burma is kind of an iffy situation in terms of, sort of human rights and sort of, general lifestyle, if you want to say anything that isn't friendly about their government. And, so there are still countries and there are still services at VOA that are alive and well. And actually the Voice of America filmed our party, our event at Meridian last Friday. And they're going to broadcast it, I think, to 45 or 6 countries. So yeah, they're very, very involved. It's still alive and well. Anybody else? And then we'll let you all free. Okay. I guess we're good. Thank you so much.